The chair certainly thanks the gentleman from Georgia, and now it is my pleasure and honor to welcome to this subcommittee's hearing two fine public servants, both who are employees of the Department of Commerce. The one, Mr. Walter Bastian, is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Western Hemisphere, the International Trade Administration. Mr. Bastian, I want to welcome you, and I want to thank you for appearing before the subcommittee and taking the time out from your busy schedule to share your thoughts with us. Our next witness on this first panel is Mr. Matthew Borman, a fine gentleman from the Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security. His former title is the Acting Assistant Secretary for Export Administration. Mr. Borman, again, my thoughts are certainly gracious, and we want to thank you so much for being here and participating in this hearing. We will ask, if you will, because it has been a new policy of the subcommittee, that you be sworn in for the purposes of giving an opening statement and participating in this hearing. So would you please raise your right hand, stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please take your seats. Please let the record reflect that all of the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Mr. Bastian, we'll ask that you provide us with an opening statement, and you can restrict your statement, if you will, to 5 minutes. I'll say more or less 5 minutes. Thank you.
There we go. Sorry. Chairman Rush, Ranking Member Radenovich, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today concerning recent events in our relationship with Cuba. I welcome your interest in this topic. Today's hearing is entitled Examining the Status of U.S. Trade with Cuba and its Impact on Economic Growth. But I can imagine that the interests of committee members extend not only to that subject, but also to the President's recent statements regarding his belief that we can move the U.S.-Cuba relations in a new direction. It is my hope that members will take no offense if I do not take this opportunity to expand upon nor to interpret the words and messages the President so capably laid out during the successful Summit of the Americas in Trinidad and Tobago. We meet at a fluid moment in U.S. policy and, as members of this committee know, setting U.S. policy towards Cuba is not within the province of the Department of Commerce. On April 13th of this year, the President directed the Secretaries of Commerce, Treasury, and State to take actions necessary to lift restrictions on family visits to Cuba, remove restrictions on remittances to family members, authorize greater telecommunications links with Cuba, and expand the scope of humanitarian donations eligible for export. These changes in our Cuba policy are designed to encourage greater contact between family members, ease the flow of remittances to Cuban families, and promote the flow of information to the Cuban people. The Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, at the Department of Commerce and Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, are hard at work implementing these policy changes. My colleague from the Bureau of Industry and Security will discuss these changes in more detail in his testimony. Reaching out to the Cuban people in this way is a demonstration of our interest in setting our relations with Cuba on a more productive and positive course. The actions we are taking will directly benefit the well-being of Cuban citizens and will remove barriers between families in both countries. Mr. Chairman, I understand that you recently returned from a visit to the island and that you, as well as a number of your colleagues, are interested in greater commercial interchange with Cuba. As you know, the United States maintains extensive legal restrictions on the ability of U.S. firms to trade with Cuba. The President has indicated his belief that the embargo should remain in place as a source of leverage for positive change in Cuba. I will very briefly delineate the mix of legislation that governs our trade relations with Cuba. The United States maintains a comprehensive trade embargo with respect to Cuba under numerous laws. That embargo was first announced by President Kennedy in Presidential Proclamation 3447 in 1962 under the authority of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961. Implementing regulations issued by the Department of Commerce and the Department of Treasury to carry out the trade embargo on Cuba relied on general authorities in the Export Control Act of 1949 and the Trading with the Enemy Act. The trade embargo on Cuba has been further shaped over the years by various pieces of legislation, including the Export Administration Act of 1979, the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992, and the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity, otherwise Libertad, Act of 1996, and the Trade Sanctions Reform and Export Enhancement Act, TSRA, of 2000. TSRA limits commerce's ability to promote and support U.S.-Cuba trade. Under TSRA, the Department is prohibited from providing the routine export assistance to U.S. exporters to Cuba that our U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service regularly provides to other U.S. firms. Despite the broad restrictions on trade with Cuba, U.S. producers exported more than $700 million in agricultural goods to Cuba in 2008, making the U.S. the largest source of food to Cuba and making us Cuba's fifth largest trading partner. Conclusion, President Obama indicated at the Summit of the Americas that the United States seeks a new beginning in its relations with Cuba. The measures announced on April 13th were intended as a signal to the people of Cuba and to the government of Cuba that the United States is prepared to pursue policies that will strengthen the ties between the people in our countries and bolster progress toward a free and democratic Cuba. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm pleased to answer any questions that you or other members of the committee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Bastian. And now we will recognize Mr. Borman for 5 minutes, more or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Radonovich, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I'd also appreciate the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee today to discuss the Bureau of Industry and Security's role in implementing the U.S. trade embargo on Cuba. I also ask that my written statement be included in the record.
So ordered.
As my colleague, Mr. Bastian, has already outlined, there are a welter of laws and regulations that govern our trade with Cuba, and I won't enumerate them again. I would point out that, in particular, the Libertad Act, among other things, codifies the trade embargo on Cuba, and it requires that the embargo remain in effect unless certain conditions are met. Most notably, either there's a transition government in place or there's already been a democratically elected government. So the Libertad Act codifies much of the current embargo. Having said that, of course, though, the President and all presidents retain some discretion to make exceptions to the embargo. And as a result of that discretionary authority, the Commerce Department has the authority to issue licenses for particular transactions or general authorizations for particular types of transactions under certain conditions. And as Mr. Bastian has already noted, the Bureau of Industry and Security regulates the export of commodities, software, and technology to Cuba, while the Office of Foreign Assets Control, Department of Treasury, regulates all transactions with Cuba, including the financing related to exports. So we at BIS handle things going to Cuba, and Treasury handles essentially everything else, all other interactions between the U.S. and Cuba. We do ours through the Export Administration regulations. Treasury has a separate set of their own regulations. Now, pursuant to the laws and regulations, almost everything in the U.S. economy needs a license, an individual authorization to go to Cuba, and there's currently a general policy of denial for most items going to Cuba under the existing embargo. Notwithstanding that general policy of denial, however, in 2008, we at BIS processed 358 applications for licenses to export to Cuba, and of those 358 applications, 235 were approved, 114 were returned without action, and 9 were denied. The total dollar value of those approved licenses was about $1.5 billion. And in addition to those individual licenses, we also processed 151 notices of agricultural exports to Cuba. This is a particular license exception we have implemented pursuant to the Trade Sanctions Reform Act, or TISRA as we call it. Of those 151 that we processed last year, 143 were approved, and they were worth about $3.2 billion, and the remaining 8 were returned without action. So those are the authorizations that we at BIS authorized individually and under the TISRA exemption. One other thing I would point out is that these authorizations include about $95 million of exports that we authorized in the last quarter of 2008 for hurricane relief specifically, and we did those in an average processing time of 5 days, which, as you can imagine, in a government bureaucracy is quite fast.
Quite impressive.
Now a word about the pending revisions to our regulations at BIS based on the President's announcement. As Mr. Bastian noted, the President directed the Secretary of Commerce in particular to further expand the scope of the license exception, that is the general authorization, regarding gift parcels to Cuba. A wider variety of items will become available to be included in the gift parcels. The dollar value for the gift parcels will go up from $400 to $800, and the universe of recipients will be expanded, although there will still be no gift parcels permitted to either high government officials, Communist Party members, or institutions or organizations controlled by either the government or the party. We will also establish a new license exception for consumer communications devices, cell phones, satellite phones, personal digital assistants, digital cameras, again to further the free flow of information between the United States and the Cuban people and among the Cuban people. And the last change that we'll implement as a result of the President's decision is to lift the personal baggage limitation. Currently, there's a limit of 44 pounds per person to take with them to Cuba. When we finalize our regulation implementing the President's directive, that limitation will be removed. So that's what we're doing to implement the President's directive. In conclusion, I just would say again that what we do is largely governed by statute as well as regulation, and we continue to work with our interagency partners, principally the State Department in this area, to implement the President's directive to meet the basic human needs of the Cuban people and facilitate contacts between the American people and the Cuban people. And with that, I conclude my oral statement, and also I'm happy to answer questions.
The Chair thanks the gentleman, and indeed the Chair thanks both of the witnesses for their fine statements.